Good Monday morning to everyone. My name is Sabine Odhiambo. I'm the Secretary General of the German Africa Foundation, and I would like to warmly welcome you today to our webinar on the future of geopolitical cooperation, South Africa and the outcomes of the 15th BRICS Summit. Thank you for tuning in, and of course, a huge thank you to our panelists. We have His Excellency Ambassador Soglal, Mr. Carvalho, Professor De Koning, Professor Dr. von Soest and Professor Zondi today talking to us about this very important topic. And of course, I would like to thank our cooperation partner, the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in South Africa, and here particularly to Professor Cyril Hendricks, the Executive Director, who will share today's discussion for us. And before I hand over to Professor Hendricks, for the introduction of the topic, as well as for the introduction of the panelists, I would like to make some technical and organizational remarks. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. However, you are welcome to already write your questions in the Q&A chat during the inputs so that we can take them up later. And if you prefer to ask a question directly, you can, after the inputs, raise your hand, use the raise your hand function, and then turn on your microphone and camera when you are invited to speak by our chair. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to our chair, Professor Hendricks. You have the word, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sabine. Excellencies, members of the diplomatic community, representatives of the South African and German governments, Sabine Odhiambo, the Secretary General of the German Africa Foundation, our esteemed panelists with special recognition for Ambassador Anil Soglal, our BRICS Sherpa for South Africa, participants, good morning, guten Morgen, welcome. Welcome to this webinar on the future of geopolitical cooperation, South Africa and the outcomes of the 15th BRICS Summit. The Institute for Justice and Reconciliation is honored to be co-hosting this webinar with the German Africa Foundation. The first BRIC Summit was held in Russia in 2009. South Africa was accepted as a full member of BRICS in 2010. Accordingly, the 15th BRICS Summit was held in Johannesburg from the 22nd to the 24th under the theme BRICS and Africa Partnership for Mutually Accelerated Growth, Sustainable Development, and Inclusive Multilateralism. BRICS sees itself as a partnership of leading emerging markets and developing countries with a historical bond of friendship, solidarity, and shared interest. They represented over 42% of the global population, 30% of the world territory, 23% of its GDP, and 18% of global trade. They also have shared a commitment to restructuring of the global political, economic, and financial architectures. Their partnership concentrates on three pillars: political and security cooperation, financial and economic cooperation, and cultural and people-to-people cooperation. The members of this grouping, two of whom have the second and third biggest economies globally, have largely felt, I think, disrespected and excluded by the global governance institutions and have been partnering to address their grievances through alternative forums of cooperation, such as BRICS. This was the third South Africa summit that South Africa hosted, and I think that South Africa always seeks to be more inclusive when it hosts these summits, and so its themes always start with BRICS and Africa. And this time round, there were many African states in attendance, 46, I believe. The BRICS Summit was dominated by the expansion of the partnership, which now includes two more African countries, Egypt and Ethiopia, as well as Argentina, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And they are now being colloquially referred to as BRICS Plus. Many others have applied to be part of BRICS, including 20 other states increases the global population representation and the GDP, as well as the percentage of global trade. It now also brings in the oil-producing countries. This significantly then increases the global political and economic weight. So what does this portend for transforming global governance architectures, for shifting global power relations, and more importantly, for challenging the global crisis, for dealing with the challenges of the global crisis we are facing, such as the increases in inter- and intra-African conflicts, large displacements of people, the backsliding of our democracies and a return to coups, climate change, energy insecurity, food insecurity, poverty, inequality, unemployment, and so forth. Certainly, the West has been looking closely at what is transpiring in BRICS. This the more so after the Russia-Ukraine conflict began, and with the speak of de-dollarization, as well as the moves towards coups in West Africa and the ousting of France's peacekeepers in some of the countries in the Sahel. BRICS has been trading on wanting to reshape global governance so that it reflects the principles of sovereign equality, non-intervention, territorial integrity, non-coercive, conflict management, adherence to international law, and so forth. In how far has it been able to do so? And can BRICS Plus enable it to further this pursuit? Or will the inevitable national interests, especially as the circle is made bigger, surface to render it too moribund? The Johannesburg Outcome Statement reiterates some of the key principles, objectives, and strategies of BRICS, most notably a reinvigorated and reformed multilateral system in which sovereign states cooperate and which seeks to ensure the promotion of democracy, human rights, and fundamental freedoms for all, as well as promote cooperation based on the spirit of solidarity, mutual respect, justice, and equality. The demand is also for greater representation, effectiveness, and efficiency of the UN Security Council and for increased support for African peace initiatives. The heads of state reiterated their appreciation for the good offices of African leaders aimed at peaceful resolution of the dispute between Russia and Ukraine. There's also strong condemnation of terrorism in all its forms, as well as an appeal for increased women's participation. With a growing geopolitical influence, how will the bloc ensure that its vision becomes a reality without creating a new order in which it practices the very same things that it has been aggrieved about? In other words, how can it use its political and economic weight and increasing legitimacy to create a better, independent, cooperative world for all? In this webinar, we are asking questions such as, what is significant in the outcomes of this 15th summit? How will BRICS Plus speed us to a new global order, and what is Africa's place in it? What are the key peace and security, economic and cultural takeaways of this summit? And what do our panelists see in the crystal ball for the future of geopolitical cooperation? Will the outcomes have any impact on German-South Africa relations? South Africa hosted a successful summit, and we congratulate it for it. But we're also in a changing regional order. And so what do we see as South Africa's role given these emerging regional political configurations? What other sources of power and influence can South Africa rely on to remain central in shaping future global governance? To discuss these and other questions, we have been able to pull together experts who have been at the center of constructing BRICS, as well as those providing thought leadership on a new emerging global order and Africa's role in it. I'm going to change the order somewhat so that we begin with your input, Ambassador Anil Sukla. Ambassador Sukla is our South African ambassador at large for Asia and BRICS, and South Africa's BRICS Sherpa. He has been at the center of it all and can provide us with an overview of the objectives and the outcomes of this BRICS Summit and what it means for South Africa and the future of geopolitical cooperation. Ambassador Sukla is a distinguished diplomat and scholar with extensive background in international relations and cooperation. Next, we'll have Gustavo de Carvalho, a senior researcher on Russia-Africa ties in the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at SAIA. Gustavo has over 15 years of experience supporting policy development, capacity building, and research processes in Africa, focusing mainly on multilateralism and the relationship between African stakeholders and external partners. He will address us on BRICS and the changing world order, prospects, opportunities, and challenges. Professor Cedric de Koning is a researcher with the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and a senior advisor for Accord. He has published extensively on peace and security issues, with his most recent books being on adaptive mediation and adaptive peace building. He recently wrote an article on BRICS and the West, and we look forward to hearing his views on whether or not the West needs to be wary of BRICS Plus in this new global order. Prof. Christian van Soest is a prominent academic in international affairs and peace and security studies. He's currently the head of a research program titled Peace and Security at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, GIGA, and he will reflect on what the outcomes could imply for Africa-German relations. Last but not least, we will have an intervention by Professor Siphamandla Zondi, who is a professor of politics and international relations at the University of Johannesburg and the director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation. He has worked extensively on issues of multilateralism and on resituating Africa in a global world order. And so we would like to hear his thoughts on these issues post the BRICS Summit. I do recognize that we do not have a woman speaker. We did try to have a woman speaker on the panel, and it reflects the need for more women to be engaged in BRICS, I think. We don't have much time, so we will limit presentations to 10 minutes. As indicated by Sabina, participants, please use the chat to ask your questions. We will leave some time at the end of the presentations to respond to them. Without further ado, I am going to hand over to Ambassador Suklal.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Firstly, let me express my appreciation and gratitude to the German Africa Foundation for convening this seminar and also inviting me. My greetings also to our fellow esteemed panelists and all of the executive members of the German Africa Foundation. Let me firstly look at the issues of the outcomes of the BRICS Summit. Did it meet our goals as chair, and also the issues that we had put on the table in terms of key priorities and deliverables? And secondly, whether it met the expectations of the BRICS membership as a whole. And then secondly, I will address the issue of implications for the future geopolitical issues. Well, as you know, and as you pointed out, Chairperson, in your opening remarks, we had a theme that was firmly focused on the partnership with Africa as a continuing theme of South Africa's hosting of the BRICS whenever we do so. And therefore, we again had BRICS and Africa Partnership for Mutually Accelerated Growth, Sustainable Development, and Inclusive Multilateralism. Now, those are 4 key areas of South Africa's chairship, looking at how we deepen the partnership between the African continent and BRICS countries. Secondly, addressing the issues of growth, and especially the role that BRICS can play collectively in stimulating growth amongst ourselves and also impacting on the global platform. Thirdly, also reflecting on the SDGs, given that we are quite behind in terms of the goals we've set for 2030 and the role BRICS can play in accelerating the process of meeting that target. And of course, fourthly, a standing agenda item of all BRICS Summit is reform of the multilateral architecture. Now, the summit itself was divided into three segments. If you look at the three-day event, the first day, of course, was devoted to the private sector and the business forum. The second day, the summit itself between the BRICS leaders, and the third day, the BRICS Africa and BRICS Plus outreach. Now, of course, it's important to look at opportunities for enhancing trade, investment, and cooperation on the business front. And this was the first opportunity that we had to collectively address the issue of stimulating growth in our respective economies and collectively, and also impacting on the African continent. So for the first time in 4 years, our business sector convened in two platforms. Firstly, on the 19th and 20th, you had the first meeting of the Women's Business Alliance. Now, the BRICS Women's Business Alliance was launched in 2020, but we did not have an opportunity for that entity to meet in person. And this was an important occasion, given that it provided a unique platform to focus on women in business, and especially the MSME sector. That was a highly successful meeting with about 800 delegates from over 20 countries, including 18 from Africa, because one of the objectives we set is to create a WBA Africa business platform, a virtual platform, to bring Africa on board in partnership with our BRICS countries, and especially in addressing the role of women in business within the African continent and in partnership with BRICS. Now, of course, that was a very successful meeting, but we had a number of pre-meetings in that the executive of the WBA had scoping missions to all of the BRICS countries during the first part of this year in preparation for the summit. And we saw a number of actual trade deals being signed. And according to the chairperson of the WBA, total trade deals signed during the summit and the various scoping missions amounted to close to 50 billion rands. Now, this is tangible opportunities in terms of providing a platform that works for women in business. Likewise, we had a number of business deals and partnerships signed during the business forum on the 21st, when the BRICS Business Council met at the business forum, where we had close to 1,000 delegates from BRICS countries, a large number of African countries, and a large number of countries from the global south that also took part in the summit. So I think on that platform, we were very satisfied that the private sector had an opportunity to look at deepening cooperation between themselves and to expand cooperation beyond the BRICS family. And I think in both these platforms that proved successful. Now, of course, looking at the summit itself, we had a retreat, firstly, prior to the summit on the evening of the 21st. Now, that was a unique platform that South Africa facilitated, where we had no set agenda, but just the 5 leaders, with President Putin participating virtually in that meeting as well, to reflect on key issues. Now, of course, 2 issues dominated the agenda from a public perspective viewpoint that was always in the public domain, that of expansion and that of BRICS currency. And the leaders had an opportunity to reflect quite robustly on both the issue of expansion and the issue of currency at that summit. And I think that provided the platform for them to be able to discuss in a very open manner the positives about expansion, and also to air some of the anxieties that may have been there in terms of BRICS expanding and how it should expand. It was a very robust discussion, and I think at the end of that discussion, there was more or less consensus on how we should proceed. But a lot of groundwork was done at the Sherpa, Sous-Sherpa level, in that we finalized the issues pertaining to guiding principles, standard criteria, and rules of procedure around expansion, which was further deliberated by foreign ministers, and also looking at the 22 countries and determining how best we can look at expansion and which of these countries we can agree on by consensus in the first stage of expansion. On the issue of currency, also, there was a very robust discussion. I must point out there was no such thing as de-dollarization on the BRICS agenda, but the issue was how do we deepen the use of national currencies in terms of trade, investment, payment settlement system. And you would have seen that the outcomes of this was reflected in paragraph 92 of the Johannesburg II Declaration, where leaders tasked for the finance ministers and or central bank governors to look at the issue of currency and payment instruments and platforms and report to the summit in Russia next year. So that process is underway formally now in terms of taking this discussion on BRICS currency forward. Now, of course, if you look at the declaration, it speaks to all of the key issues in quite detailed manner. Apart from the preamble, the issue of reform of the multilateral global architecture is reflected in about 8 paragraphs under the Partnership for Inclusive Multilateralism, looking at the issues of peace and security, including all global hotspots within Africa and Europe, the Middle East and Latin America. That's dealt with extensively under the topic fostering an environment of peace and development. Thereafter, we look at the Partnership for Mutually Accelerated Growth, followed by the Partnership for Sustainable Development. And of course, we also look at the people-to-people dimension of cooperation quite extensively, about 11 paragraphs dealing with that. And finally, institutional development, including the issue of expansion in paragraph 91, 92, as well as tasking foreign ministers to look at the question of developing modalities for a partnership model with regard to those countries that are keen to have some association with BRICS. Now, the third day of the summit was devoted to the outreach with Africa and the BRICS Plus countries. We had 61 delegations in attendance, together with the Secretary General of the UN. And I think the message there spoke very strongly to issues of global concern, especially to the global south, issues of development, the impact of the COVID pandemic, the major power conflict, especially on the African continent in terms of food security, energy security, its impact on energy, impact on climate change and its devastation on economies. So a number of the key issues were echoed repeatedly by leaders at that summit. Now, I think one has to also look at the outcome of the BRICS Summit in context of what is transpiring globally. And the meeting took place at a time of major power contestation. And I think BRICS were at pains also to point out that the BRICS is not a counterweight to any other formations. BRICS is about consolidating the partnership between themselves, addressing the issue of expansion, the need to look at seriously those countries wanting a formal relationship with BRICS, and also deepening cooperation with the global south and especially the African continent. And I think on this front, South Africa as chair, we did quite well in bringing together the global south, in articulating the key challenges that we face and calling for these issues to be comprehensively addressed in an inclusive manner, in partnership between ourselves as the global south. But we've also indicated that we will work with all entities, north and south, in an inclusive manner to look at real reform, genuine reform of the global geopolitical, financial, and economic trade architecture. And I think this is very well articulated within the various paragraphs of the Johannesburg II Declaration. And I think you have to also look at the outcomes of the BRICS Summit in context of the recently concluded G20 Summit this past weekend. If you look at the New Delhi Leaders Declaration and you look at the Johannesburg II Declaration, there are a large number of synergies in terms of the key areas addressed at the BRICS Summit as well as the G20 Summit. And I think the G20 Summit also brought sharp focus on the developing world and championing the key developmental issues as it impacts on the global community. But again, calling for partnership. And I think this is what we need to see going forward. Going forward, we have two roads that we could take. We could take the road towards partnership and collaboration, or we could take the road to greater contestation, competition, and greater division of the global community. I think the expanded BRICS is about, it's not about expansion in terms of wanting to become an entity that seeks to work against any current other existing platforms. But it is about deepening multilateralism. It is about reforming the multilateral global architecture. It speaks to the centrality of the UN Charter, its purposes and principles. It speaks to upholding international law. It speaks to upholding the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. So all of these key issues that should be party to a reform process in creating a more inclusive multilateralism. And that's why we very pointedly chose the term inclusive multilateralism, because we are not there yet as a global community. And I think that was also the theme of the G20 in terms of what India, as chairship presidency of the G20, tried to portray. And I think what is important to also look at is that with the addition of Saudi Arabia and Argentina, we now have within BRICS 7 G20 members, and equally balanced with the G7. Together with the African Union, you have a balance with the European Union membership. So I think that also is a very important development in terms of the balance between the global South and the global North within the G20. But it showed, I think, the outcome of the New Delhi summit showed that there is a possibility for the North and the South to collaborate and work together in addressing the issues of global concern to all of us. And I think that's what BRICS also tried to demonstrate in a collective manner. Let me leave it there, Chair, because I think I've exceeded my time. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Ambassador Anil Sukla, for that comprehensive overview of not only the outcomes of the BRICS Summit, but where we're going to with this, and then bringing in G20 as well. And stressing, I think, that this is not about a contestation with other formations out there, not a competition, but it's about cooperation, inclusivity, partnerships, deepening multilateralism, and we should be focusing on that. I'm going to now hand over to Gustavo.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Thank you for the other panelists. Thank you, Ambassador Sukla. You made my life, and I assume the other panelists' life, much easier now. I think there is a lot that we can cover from the remarks on what happened with the BRICS Summit and what are the expectations for the future. So I was asked to talk a little bit in terms of this intersect between BRICS and global geopolitical change and the global order. And I wanted to start with, in the last couple of weeks, many researchers, many analysts have been asking ourselves and have asked the question of, is BRICS in a way changing the global order, or is the global order already changing? And I think, well, it's still probably too soon to know that. My feeling at this stage is that there is the latter. There is a strong perception between countries within the global south, whatever the global south means in that sense. I know it is often a contested concept, but I think it does provide the understanding that many within the so-called global south have been increasingly seeing the space within the global order as limited, particularly in line with the increasing growth, increasing presence in terms of academic, economic, political, and social capabilities that these countries have. And that to a certain extent is very much in line with some of the shifts, the very competitive global space that to a certain degree, while it's not the same as what we saw during the Cold War periods, there is a lot that resonates in terms of this rivalry between global powers. And I think some of you may have seen there is a number of recent papers that have been published, and there is one in particular from Geopolitics journal talking about why this potential second Cold War can teach us in terms of where we are in terms of global competition. And I think there's four interesting arguments around that. And I think particularly because Cold War now is far more related to issues related to infrastructural development, digital world, production, and financial. And when we look into many of these issues, we can increasingly see how those geopolitical components are really embedded within many of the discussions around BRICS. I wanted to just start with a disclaimer that, of course, doing geopolitical analysis of times, it is quite limiting, and it brings you into this old age debate in international relations between idealists and realism to a certain degree. So in that sense, my disclaimer is that I understand my analysis very much focused on geopolitics. It is somehow cynical, and it comes with the geopolitical lenses around that, but by no means is the only way in which we can frame and see the role of BRICS in the world. And I think if we look into those two big topics that we had within the summit, and Ambassador Sukla mentioned them very well, they largely talk about how these originally 5 countries, now 11 countries, that in fact had very little in common with one another. They're from different regions, they are from different developmental experiences, they're part of different dynamics globally, which to a certain extent shows that BRICS often is trying to work with a minimum common denominator. It's not really trying to be a panacea for foreign policy of all of its members. It has very specific areas in which it has engaged in the past, but also that we are expecting to see in the future. And I think those big subjects about expansion and the use of currencies to a large degree showcases where BRICS is going at the moment. Because when we ask ourselves, why those 6 countries? Why not other countries? And I think that it's, while many of us are still waiting to see more clarity around the criteria that were used, there's certainly some commonalities amongst themselves that I think is important for us to reflect. When we look into countries like Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, they are particularly important not only because they are oil-producing countries. I think Egypt's in a much lesser degree than the other countries, but particularly because they are very much involved in this trade infrastructure that is increasingly politicized globally. If we look into the importance of the Suez Canal, the importance of the Bab el-Mandab Strait, the importance of the Strait of Hormuz, to a large degree, these are countries, and Iran as the notable exception in that have historical relations with Western countries, but increasingly sees themselves in a region without the security guarantor that we saw the United States being for a number of years, and largely to do with this freckle revolution in North America and the United States moving from being the largest oil purchaser in the world to be the largest oil producer in the world. So to a large degree, when we look into those specific countries, they are especially important for Asian members of BRICS when we're looking into the role of Russia, and Russia being very active in looking for alternatives that may allow the country to overcome the Western sanctions. And the pearl of its own project of going back into the global economy has a lot to do with the North-South corridor, the connection between Moscow and Mumbai, going through Azerbaijan, going through Iran, and connecting Mumbai as a key connection between Russia and Asia. Didn't surprise me that in the G20 summit, one of the biggest announcements was this new corridor between Mumbai and Greece. And all of them has to do with connectivity, trade infrastructure, and ability of countries to reduce what they perceive as the global order as being increasingly risky for them. And that risky aspect of that has to do with their own ability of engaging with countries in other parts of the world. There was, of course, the questions around why Ethiopia and why Argentina, if they are not part of those. And I think those have to do with their own regional relevance. And I think Ethiopia in particular, a country that despite being a landlocked country, it is the most influential countries within the Horn of Africa, an economy that has been growing very fast, very large population, and increasingly a country with far less, despite its own domestic issues, has been building much closer relations with its non-landlocked neighbors, mainly Eritrea and Djibouti, to enable them to project more of their own capacity, of the more influence in the region, including talks from the Ethiopian defense forces in the last year on the need of building a better navy, of engaging in the region, and naturally that area would go, of course, towards the Bab el-Mandab Strait and the relevance it has in terms of global trade. Argentina, of course, is not one of the countries that fits in this kind of broader Middle Eastern agenda, and it had a lot to do with Brazil. Many of us that were attending the BRICS Summit saw that there was a lot of tension, not necessarily tension, but a lot of debate between members, and Brazil being not particularly keen on that expansion, really making its final decision in the last minute, and Argentina seemingly has something to do with that. But of course, Argentina in itself brings a number of risks for the group in terms of the elections that are happening at the moment. There is a likelihood, or at least a good chance, that either a center-right or a far-right government may win in Argentina. And 2 out of the 3 main contenders in the country already stating that they are not interested in joining BRICS. So, of course, we would have to see whether post-election Argentina, the government will indeed accept it. Of course, another element into that, which I think many we're interested in, is the liquidity aspects that many of these oil-producing countries would provide to BRICS. And I think it's not something that we should underestimate, particularly when it links to the discussions around the use of local currencies, payment systems, and I don't think at this stage there is much of conversations around reserves, but at some point, potentially, because you then provide a space in which the liquidity of its members and its ability of trading with one another with local currencies increases its chances, especially when you look into the fact that countries like China and India in particular are some of the largest buyers of oil and gas from the Middle East, and to a large degree, other members of BRICS have very close connections with them as well. But I think these issues that were discussed this year to a large degree will dominate much of these geopolitical aspects of BRICS. To a certain extent, all of these announcements around infrastructural developments on trade that haven't started in BRICS or in the G20, but those groups increasingly become part of the debate. Whether we're talking about the North-South corridor, whether we're talking about the BRI from the Chinese, whether we're talking about this Mumbai-Greece new corridor that was announced, and to a certain degree, really potential opportunities for global South countries and potential opportunities for countries that are somehow in the middle of those geopolitical disputes but also some risks for the global order, especially if we start creating a number of these parallel systems of governance and global governance that increasingly become part of. And I'm not by any means suggesting that BRICS is the only alternative global governance system. I think we've increasingly see there's American, Chinese, international competition really trickling down to other forums, and especially BRICS in that regard. There will be very important discussions that would have to be made within BRICS, particularly when it comes to the issue of decision making. And I think Professor Suklaw presented some of those dynamics, but I wanted to reinforce that because I think there is opportunities that bring to that, but a lot of new dynamics that we may not be accustomed within BRICS that we'll have to consider. The first one is, despite the Chinese efforts this year to mediate an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, that remains a really important issue within the Middle East, and dynamics with this Middle Eastern Cold War that very impactful not only in the region, and we see when it comes to issues related to Syria, to Lebanon, and particularly with Yemen and the competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran and how that would evolve. The second issue related to the Ethiopian-Egyptian rivalry in the region, and particularly when it comes to the issue of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and the potential for escalation of the tension, especially as we see Ethiopia in the new phase of filling the dam that happened in the last couple of days. The final one, which I briefly mentioned, that new dynamics that we need to explore, has to do with Argentina itself. One, in relation to its own political environments in the country and what would be the appetite of a new government to join BRICS or not, noting that the financial crisis and political situation in Argentina is quite volatile at the moment. But I think particularly when it comes to Argentina's own bilateral relations with Iran. Next year is the 30th anniversary of the bombing of the Jewish Association in Buenos Aires, which largely led to particularly almost frozen relations between Iran and Argentina, and would be interesting to see, and for existing and new members to identify how would that impact overall dynamics around that. So just to conclude, I wanted to talk a little bit what is in it for particularly countries like South Africa and Brazil. And for me, these are the two countries that are slightly out of this geopolitical axis of BRICS, but also to a lot of other countries within the global South and their aspirations to play a role as a non-aligned country globally. And I think to a certain degree, this very geopolitical aspects of BRICS, I think it does bring a few reflections, and I'm just going to list them so that we can bring into some of the discussions. One of them is that it's clear that differently from the Cold War, where you had two countries that largely dealt with their areas of influence as a direct means of control, we are starting to see more and more that control from global powers much more based on specific networks and specific areas, whether they're in terms of infrastructure, whether they're in terms of digital spaces, whether in terms of production, or even when it comes to financial. So it's unsurprising for me that a lot of the value aspects that many of us often complain about countries like South Africa and your more democratic countries within BRICS, they have a role within BRICS, but I would say they have a much more secondary role at this particular stage. And we should expect, considering the way that the global economy is formed, the much more interdependence between global economies at this stage, that we're still going to get a lot of countries within the global South and even some within the global North with these difficulties of under which sides are we engaging with. Our capacity to project power independently is much more limited, and thus that engagement with the two sides, if I could call it this way, seems to me a pretty pragmatic choice that many do, instead of being one based on entirely on values. And I think this is a big question that countries like South Africa will be making moving forward. We've seen many of the demands made by South Africa in multilateral negotiations that are often linking whichever partnerships that are being made to be made with the eye of increasing the added value of the presence of Africa internationally. And I think it brings some interesting triangulations that will be happening in the future or should be happening in the future. The first is, how do we bring closer links between BRICS, G20, and particularly now that the African Union has joined, and the third one, the African Continental Free Trade Area. And to a large degree, I think those bring many opportunities for the continent to increase not only the complementarity between its own economies, but also to reshape the way in which the continent presents itself in global political disputes in a much stronger manner. But I think the second triangulation that should be made going forward, and I think Ambassador Suclau mentioned that very briefly, is this triangulation between BRICS, G7, and G20. And I think it's something that the more we generate narratives that puts these blocks in opposition to one another, I think the more complicated that is for the very shaping of global governance. There is a need to acknowledge to a certain degree the global South countries have much more relevance now than what they used to have, and particularly in the 2 decades of the overly dominance of the United States in the global order. But we do need to find ways not only to integrate them, but also integrate all of those different multilateral and global governance structures that are there. So let me stop here. I went a bit over time, but if there is any particular issues, we can continue in the Q&A.
Thank you, Gustavo. I allowed you to go a little bit over time because of the depth of your intervention there, really outlining those geopolitical aspects for us, noting in the beginning that this global order seemed to have limited space for these emerging countries, that it is a very competitive space, and then focusing a little bit on the commonalities and differences between these countries that have now joined BRICS, their own needs for connectivity, for trade infrastructure, new corridors, liquidity aspects, also then looking at the risks of these parallel governance structures and the need to focus more on how do we begin to look at them in a more integrative, inclusive manner, G7, G20, etc. And decision-making, given tensions around Saudi Arabia and Iran, Ethiopia and Egypt, and the appetite for a new government in Argentina to still belong to BRICS. So many thanks for that. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Cedric de Cunha.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, and good morning, everyone. It's been a real pleasure to listen to your analysis, Cheryl, but also to Anil Suclau and to Gustavo de Carvalho. I've learned a lot. I will zero in on the question of whether the BRICS and the expanded BRICS can be seen as a strategic rival for the West. I'm a South African scholar based in Norway, so I'm particularly exposed to the debates here and the perceptions from within Europe and from within Scandinavia and so on. And I would say here definitely the BRICS are seen as a threat to a liberal global order, and that's why I'm particularly interested in understanding and thinking through the development of the BRICS from that perspective. And I think what's important for countries to understand globally is exactly, what is it that the BRICS countries, that bring the BRIC countries together? What is the center of gravity? And from my understanding, it is that these countries have a shared frustration, if not a grievance, about being sidelined to the periphery of the world economy. Depending on however you count it, and you gave a number of statistics in the beginning, Cheryl, the fact is that the BRICS are roughly on par with the combined size of the G7 economies. and perhaps more importantly, in the next few decades, the combined size of the BRICS or BRICS Plus economies will probably surpass that of the G7. So that's the larger context within which we see ourselves. But despite that roughly being on par, or in future perhaps even increasing the size of the proportion of the BRICS economies to the world, these countries still see themselves, perhaps with the exception of Russia, as being part of the global south. In other words, are feeling excluded from a global system dominated by the global north. And therefore, their stated aim is to work towards a future system of global governance where they will have equal political and economic say in global institutions, and where no one state will dominate others. And this, I think, is a very special opportunity for also the countries in the West to help reshape a future global order that can prevent China or any other country dominating the world in the same way that the US have dominated the world during the unipolar era. So in that sense, I really see this as an opportunity, not just for the BRICS, but for really for very many countries who may have some of the shared interests, I think, here. And I think this is, or what I would say is that if we look at this aspect, we can see that the BRICS is a strategic partnership, not an alliance or a union. In other words, whilst many of the BRIC countries share this macroeconomic analysis and geopolitical interests, they also have competing interests in other domains. So it's not a all-domain alliance or a system-wide union. And I think Gustavo has explained a number of those fault lines. I'm not going to list them all again. One of the things I will point out that Gustavo didn't mention is, from the perspective in the West, the BRICS are often seen as somehow a club of autocrats. And of course, with Brazil, India, South Africa, and now also Argentina, we have a growing number of democracies within the BRICS. And that, of course, also implies a tension in terms of certain values within the BRIC member states. And I have worked before on kind of the BRICS approach to coexistence. So my interpretation is that from the BRICS perspective, the idea of coexistence as a principle of global governance is that there is a resistance to force countries to follow one particular system of governance. But there's an acknowledgement of a coexistence of multiple systems of governance and the need for those to coexist. So although on the one hand, the BRICS members, I think, share a number of core values or at least interest in terms of this macroeconomic analysis, there's also many other tensions. I think one of the things important to highlight is that many of the members of the BRICS also have close ties to the United States and Europe, especially in the expanded context, thinking of countries like Egypt, India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and South Africa. Saudi Arabia and the UAE also host large US military bases. So for many of these countries, I think it's important to understand that BRICS does not necessarily imply prioritizing one set of relations, for instance, with China over others, for instance, the United States. These countries see BRICS as a strategic partnership around one or certain set of shared values and interests, which I think, as I said before, can be summarized as this interest in a more fair and equal global order, where at the same time, they may have competing interests or tensions or values on other issues. So I think this shift in the center of gravity in the global economy to the east is a medium to long-term unstoppable fact driven by demographics and economic factors like cost of production. At the same time, Europe and the United States will remain major economic players in a future global order. So in this context, I think if we see a changing global order, it's clear that the global political order will become more multipolar, with China, Europe, India, and the United States representing some of these major centers of influence. And many of the BRICS countries, including, as I mentioned before, China, Egypt, India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, South Africa, who have economies that are closely tied to the American economy, will have an interest in working for this changing global order in a way that is evolutionary and slow, so that the freeing up of the international financial system, for instance, can give the global economy and the financial system time to adapt. They don't have an interest in the kind of change that could also see their economies being negatively affected. And the same logic also applies, I think, to other dimensions of change in the global order. Apart from Russia, perhaps all the other BRIC countries have an interest in making sure that the global order they are pursuing are managed at a slow and steady pace that does not generate instability. They are strong supporters of multilateralism, with the United Nations at its center. 2 of the BRICS members are permanent members of the UN Security Council, but they support reform of the United Nations, including especially the World Trade Organization and the Security Council. They spoke about giving a greater voice to developing countries and to make it more democratic, representative, effective, and efficient. And what was interesting at this particular summit is that for the first time, the BRICS came out in support of Brazil, India, and South Africa's ambitions to become permanent members of the Security Council. In previous summits, the BRICS only acknowledged this interest, and observers widely believe that, for instance, China would block India's Security Council aspirations. So it's interesting to see this change in this declaration. So I'll conclude by saying that the BRICS, I see BRICS and I understand BRICS as a strategic partnership among its members around a certain set of shared values and interests, which can be summarized as this interest in a more fair and equal global order, where no one country or set of countries dominate the system in their favor. At the same time, the BRICS share certain, or whilst I would say the BRICS share certain macroeconomic and geopolitical interests, many of the members also have competing interests in other domains. So it's not an all-domain alliance or a system-wide union. And many of the BRICS members maintain close relations with the US and Europe, including hosting US military bases, as I said. But this, again, does not mean that they are allied to the US in all domains or share deep US and Western values. Many Western countries, therefore, I think, and BRICS members thus have shared interest and values in some domains, whilst they may have competing interest and values in others. So I think the relationship between the BRICS and the West is much more complex and nuanced than the Cold War headlines suggest. And so whilst it's prudent to be cautious, it may also be wise for all countries to explore cooperation in those areas where they have shared interests, rather than assume that the BRICS and the West are strategic rivals on all fronts. Thank you. Back to you, Cyril.
Thank you so much, Cedric. Really now taking us to more of a peace and security lens on the outcomes of this BRICS Summit. And because you're situated in the West, can speak to some of the perceptions in the West, where you note BRICS is seen as a threat to the liberal order, as a club of autocrats, to quote you, and then you're giving your own perception that it is not an alliance, it's not a union, it's a strategic partnership. It is really about creating a new world order in which there is no one country dominating in the ways in which we've seen over the last 3 decades, speaking to BRICS's approach of coexistence, but also speaking to some of the tensions that you will find, and then saying that because of some of these tensions and different alliances with Europe and the US, we will see more likely an evolutionarily slow approach to changes in that international order, more adaptive approach. Thank you very much. We will now go to Prof. Christian von Soet.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the German Africa Foundation and the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation for the invitation and the opportunity to speak at this event. I'd like to also stress, of course, that this is my personal assessment and interpretation of the BRICS Summit and the wider implications also for the relationship between South Africa and Germany and Europe more broadly. I would like to speak about 3 issues in particular and keep the first one rather brief because my esteemed co-speakers here on this panel have also alluded to it. So first, about, like, from my perspective, what BRICS and BRICS Plus actually is. I would concur that it is currently it's a partnership rather than a strongly integrated alliance. And stating the obvious, it's in the making. So we don't know yet how deep collaboration and maybe perhaps even integration at some point in different issue areas will be. Certainly, just a few remarks. It is not yet an association of common values. It's pretty clear that, as Cyril Ramaphosa said, it's driven very much by the frustration about how world trade, the rules of international organizations are also being structured, and that they are favoring the West. But there's a bundle of very different motivations apart from like countering Western dominance, for instance, in the World Bank, the IMF, also dollar dominance, the rules that benefit the West. And I guess it's important in Europe to appreciate that some of these issues are valid points. Just 2 examples, 2 very different examples. The European Union system of subsidies for its agriculture, which make it very hard also for other countries also to, in Africa in particular, to invest in the value-added production of agricultural goods. For instance, export is possible, but it's much harder to value-add those products. And the second example is I work a lot on international sanctions, and also there really is an inconsistent applications of sanction pressure. Just let me remind you about former President Trump's maximum pressure campaign on Iran, like kind of ending the JCPOA with Iran, which had been was not negotiated before for years. So that was unpredictable and driven by domestic concerns rather than international developments when it comes to the nuclear program. So there are genuine concerns, and it's important to also appreciate that from the European and also from the American standpoint. Secondly, when it comes to the summit, I guess the extension was not expected, so that they moved so fast and admitted 6 countries was not expected. I did not expect this. I just more expected a roadmap for association. Gustavo alluded to kind of one of the principles. For me, still, it's not entirely clear what the criteria were for the association of new members. When it comes to the economic weight, then in Africa, definitely countries like Nigeria, Kenya, or Algeria would also be potential candidates. So here, the kind of the criteria for association are not entirely clear, and as I said, still in the making. And finally, on the composition and what BRICS really is, maybe on a bit more critical note here than Cyril Ramaphosa, I think there is a dominating member when it comes to political and economic might within this BRICS and even BRICS Plus grouping, and that is China. And I guess China also may use this or is trying to use this this association also as a way to project power. And here, I guess, from the West, from a realistic point of view, maybe it's good that there is that there are counterweights. India comes to mind, of course, Brazil, but I think there is this dimension, this power, this realistic dimension also to BRICS, the formation, and also the extension of BRICS. My second point is that Germany and Europe more broadly should embrace it, should also find a positive like engagement with BRICS and BRICS Plus. What you clearly see here is with the also expansion of BRICS is that international politics moves to an interest-based, if you will, more transactional also approach to international politics. If you will, everybody is digging for gold and like kind of fostering economic opportunities, maybe also more quick gains than long-term strategies. I guess that's a clear kind of expression of this international trend and also a driver, of course. And you see that the European Union, also the US, are also is increasingly playing this game. Would just like to remind you of the European Union's Global Gateway Initiative, and Gustavo de Qualia alluded to it. Also, the recent engagement with infrastructure projects from India to Greece, for instance. So I guess we are moving, and we're seeing this, that we are very much moving to what could be called special purpose alliances, and in German Zweckbündnisse, which go beyond like the value-driven coalitions. So it's not necessarily a contradiction, but of course these special purpose alliances have become or are becoming way more important. Secondly, I guess also there is also a certain level of mistrust against the West, which drives also the further development of BRICS, and I guess we will see and expect also the BRICS grouping as a vehicle to voice concerns and also criticism, and in order to change and adjust those international rules of the global order. I guess the implication will also be that international politics are less driven by the West. That was others alluded to it, but it will also maybe perhaps mean that it will be more chaotic. So there needs to also be an agenda to ensure that those Zweckbündnisse, special purpose alliances do not affect in a negative way international organizations like the United Nations. So I guess for Germany and the European Union here, it's in the future, it's both. It's transactional, and they've done it in the past, of course, and value-based. Here, organizations like the European Union, NATO, and G7, of course, come to mind. Important will be not to frame this these new grouping or the international politics at large as autocracies versus democracy versus democracies. I guess that really is the wrong framing. And my sense is that this alliances of democracies initiative from the US government has gotten less traction in the kind of, say, last 1 or 2 years. But of course, we can discuss this, particularly given the Russian aggression on Ukraine. That brings me to my last issue in the last 2 minutes that I have. So the BRICS Summit in South Africa, I think it's clear that it was a very successful summit for the South African government and also for President Ramaphosa, of course. The African voice is much louder now, also in the BRICS and BRICS Plus grouping. And I guess we might see even more African partners in the BRICS Plus grouping in the years to come. So this is, of course, an important kind of reference point also for international politics in order to also deal with international challenges. But that can also affect to some extent the relationship between Europe and South Africa. And I think is when it comes to the positioning and how I see the positioning of the foreign policy South Africa, I think South Africa has moved from being a bridge builder to the West. Just the climate summit in Copenhagen in 2009 comes to mind here, to clearly situate and also speak for the global South and also Africa. And I guess also Western foreign policies should acknowledge that. And finally, we also should acknowledge that this grouping or these notions of the global south, also the West, should not or must not lead to the expectation that these are homogeneous or monolithic entities, but that the interests and the perspectives are quite different in these groupings, and that we need to also tackle complexity. I guess that will be one of the main tasks for the future foreign policy. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Francis. Really also emphasizing the need for complexity and nuanced analysis of this BRICS formation, noting that its impetus was through this frustration with the global order, mistrust of the West, but also that the West now has genuine concerns, especially the EU. You were asking about the criteria for the new membership. You were posing the question, is China not a dominant member in this particular BRICS club? That these new members, or BRICS Plus, is not monolithic or homogeneous. But noting that Germany should embrace it, it is motivated by national interests. You called it, I noted, a special purpose alliance. But concluding there with South Africa and its new role, and you say it's shifting from being a bridge builder to almost speaking for Africa, if not more broadly, the global south. Many thanks for your inputs. Our last speaker is Prof. Siphamandla Zondi.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thanks to the speakers who've pretty much covered quite a lot of ground. Let me just make a few things that have been established. The first thing is that the geopolitics are changing. On the one hand, there is a return of the old geopolitics of binary, the us against them, the geopolitics of conflict, the geopolitics of competition, geopolitics of checkmating rather than cooperation, rather than complementing, rather than consensus, and all of that. And in that context, there's a return of the power of might rather than the power of rights. And it's changing in that way. Secondly, it is changing in the sense this change manifests also in the form of growing agency of the global south. Pretty much a reaffirmation of the Bandung spirit. The global south is setting itself as an independent source of ideas, very interested in global commons, very interested in seeing things going, fierce independence without arrogance and antagonism, growing role of bridge builders within the global south that are emerging and taking on their position and trying to develop and stitch up the global consensus. It also manifests this growing agency of the global south in ideational leadership, from the old ideas of the new international economic order of the 1970s, to ideas of solidarity, to ideas more recently of responsibility while protecting, it came from Brazil, idea of sustainable development, the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities, idea of inclusive economic development, idea of inclusive material. So it is an agency that comes with ideas that are meant to make it possible to stitch up this new world. Besides the changing geopolitics, there's also growing bridging that has been happening. But this growing bridging has been happening for more than about 2 decades now. If you think about the G8 outreach and the G8 dialogue that resulted, for example, the G8 Africa Partnership in the early 2000s, there was an attempt to bridge this divide that is produced by the the old geopolitics of binaries, the us against them. And I think that the G20 is really an outcome of that attempt to bridge, for it is G8 plus 12 other entities. And this bridging is about cooperation for global commons. It is about having tough discussions and tough negotiations about things we diverge on, be it on climate change, be it on energy transition, be it on the development elements of world trade, be it international finance, be it finance for economic development, and culminating in the post-2009 attempt to develop consensus about how we should manage global economic governance following the global financial crisis of 2009. I think that BRICS is born in this very climate of a search for the new, this very climate of bridge building, this very climate of a global South agency that is not selfish and narrow, but it's about the global commons. It's about the global agendas, global values and principles that are moving forward. It is, BRICS is born alongside 5 or 6 other smaller multilaterals, what we call minilaterals, like the KIBETS, IPSA, like the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, like the MINT, like the MENTA. There's so many. There are about 7 of them that are born at the same time as BRICS, and the idea, they are born as a byproduct of this process of bridging that has been taking place over the past 2 decades. They share this among them, the sense that they are seeking to underwrite the agenda of bigger bodies like the non-aligned movement, the G7, 7 plus China, the United Nations and others, try to underwrite it by being more nimble, more concrete on ideas on what must be implemented and all of that. So they have this ability to use their smallness to develop concrete ideas and try to implement them. At the same time, those small as they are economically, demographically, and politically big enough to give voice to these ideas. And that has, for me, been a very interesting one. But a very interesting element is that all of them share this idea that they are not actually replacing the G7, but they are becoming an alternative way of doing what G7 is doing. So they are not trying to be a new G7. They are trying to underwrite the global agenda in ways that are more inclusive, in a way that are more sensitive to ideas that have been excluded for over 80 years, and all of them. So those that have been excluded by the G7, NATO, Northern formation are now being given expression. Therefore, they come across as not having this sense that they need to checkmate the North, but to enable the achievement of goals that all sides show, all sides share, and therefore bring about new energy to the evolution of the United Nations before they believe in the United Nations. Now, what is South Africa's story in this? South Africa's story in this is the key DNA for South Africa that's very relevant for now is 3 elements. One is South-South cooperation, which is a principle number 3 in South Africa's foreign policy for consistent. The second is North-South relations, and there's a careful choice of words. It's South-South cooperation, and then it's North-South relations, which is principle number 4 in South Africa's foreign relations, quite consistent. And the last one is African agenda. These 3 define South Africa's outlook, almost its default position in the world. And they give rise to its interest in bridge building. For it is South-South cooperation, which is built up of solidarity among the countries of the South, trading among themselves on the terms Bandung defined, but at the same time, work to build relations with the North that are equal, more horizontal, fairer, and mutually beneficial at the same time. It's not either or it's not a geopolitics of binaries. And that is why it is a foreign policy position that requires ability to take on consultation, deal with divisions, use dialogue as perhaps the most important instrument of foreign policy in all of that. So it shares, therefore, South Africa with a number of other global South agents this tendency. And I'm thinking here about Indonesia, India, Turkey, Brazil, Malaysia, some extent Argentina, Mexico, and others. This idea that we will relate to the East and relate to the West at the same time, we need them both. We don't need either or that. So South Africa is pretty much part of it. Then lastly, with regard to the summit, then, how does this all find expression? To me, the agreement on the reform of the United Nations and an agreement not just broadly on the need for UN reform. The BRICS have been agreed on this for a while, but agreement on the idea that there must be regional representation in this reform, meaning that Africa, Asia, and Latin America must be accommodated in the top echelons of the United Nations. It is a significant decision. It does signal that the BRICS realize that these countries, these continent regions, and countries like Brazil, India, and South Africa, the IPSA, can play a significant role in shaping and redefining the terms of international relations, as President Ramaphosa said in a media conference a few days ago. The second thing for me is expansion, which is the second expansion. The first expansion happened when South Africa was invited in, and order. And the recognition that part of this expansion is that the idea of BRICS is a shared aspiration of many countries for a fairer global governance, financial investment, trading system that is based on rules that apply equally to all countries, as it was quoted. So that idea that you're expanding because these countries share that. They may disagree on anything, but they share the idea of building this fairer global system and all of that. It's a very interesting because it's pretty much true to how BRICS has been built. It's never been about them having affinity, as Cyril indicated earlier, but also the idea that we are expanding on the basis that this offers opportunities to expand BRICS as a market for goods from South Africa, from Brazil, from Russia, from any of these countries that I covered. And also, it expands the zone of intra-BRICS cooperation, which is important for BRICS to build its internal fuel by which it will sustain itself going forward. So it's not just outward looking, but it's also inward looking at the same time. And also that is expansion, therefore also is meant to increase the global significance and actorness of BRICS, enabling it to have a voice in the world. I mean, to have a third of global economy, 46% global population is that. The third thing for me, which is one before last, is extension of BRICS. You know, there's expansion of BRICS, and there's extension of BRICS. This talk about now systematizing this partnership, systematizing this dialogue BRICS has been having with other, leading to a BRICS Plus kind of formation, which has brought to the BRICS somewhere around 70 countries over the last, since 2013, actually, when South Africa began with the dialogue, the outreach process. About 70 countries are kind of in the loop. Some are in the outer circles of BRICS, in the outer concentric circles of BRICS and stuff. The decision to give this systematic order of some form and format of some form is a significant decision, because it makes the BRICS its better expansion and its significance grow very, very. We expected that it was going to have to talk about Ukraine And then it makes the point about peaceful settlement of conflict. Again, it's a Bandung principle that all conflicts must be settled peacefully. And I think that's a message that goes to Russia as much as it goes to Ukraine and the West, that there is no finalization of any conflict on military terms. Military victory is no way to end any form of dispute or conflict or situation of this nature. And in this, the BRICS also is very close to the G20. The G20 talks about building peace, but like the BRICS, the G20 also talks about including women and others who are included, talks about reinvigorating the multilateral, reforming multilateral institutions, inclusive growth, accelerating sustainable development, dealing with green issues, dealing with digital transformation and issues of that nature. And lastly, on the West, what's the issue? To me, the most important thing is that if it is true that there is an evolution of the geopolitics, and this evolution is contending with the old geopolitics of us against them, there are some tough negotiations, dialogue, reaching out and all that must happen, because the Washington, Brussels, London, Ottawa, and Tokyo have designated China as an arch enemy, have made China the biggest occupation we should have, rather than poverty, rather than exclusion, rather than underdevelopment, rather than multilateral, exclusive multilateral divisions and all that. It has made a country, China, because of its economic power and its expansion and all that, and fears about its economic power by countries that don't fear the economic power of the United States. Somehow they fear that of China. So they lock themselves into that as the definition of their global actors for the coming decades. Because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they have also designated Russia as an arch enemy. And I think this idea of arch enemies by major powers that have been there for a long period of time is a serious threat to improved global governance. It will be a serious threat to the agents of the global South and in Africa. Let me not elaborate, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Siphamandla. We're running out of time, and I do want us to at least answer the questions in the chat, but you really contextualized where we are at in terms of the debates around geopolitics and the changes in the global order. Noting that we are again operating on the basis of binaries. Binaries are back, you notice. And that here was a grouping of countries very much with an urgency to shift the global order, to stitch up this new world order, you said, to give voice to the aspirations of the global South, and to underwrite some of the values and motivations of bigger formations like G77, the non-aligned group, etc., and seeing BRICS very much as a bridge builder to that. I want us to go immediately into questions. Sabina will summarize the debates for us, so I won't do that. I want us to at least have a chance to look at the chat. We have Webster Zambara noting Minister Naledi Pandor confirmed that the French president formally requested to attend the BRICS Summit in South Africa and his request was declined. Does this mean BRICS deliberately keeps out the West even when they may wish to be part of the group? We have Advocate Mamani, may we receive the recording? Okay, that's a general question. We have Uta, can the recording? Okay, also a recording. We have Jeremy Routledge. Okay, also please ask the panel to comment on how this global realignment proposed in the Johannesburg Declaration impacts on the women, peace and security agenda, especially in view of the lack of progress in implementing the UN Security Council resolutions. I think the 15th BRICS Summit had spent some time reflecting on women's participation in peace and security, so a good question there. Yeah, just in a general closure for 1 minute, I think we've spoken a lot about what is BRICS, and different panelists see this formation differently: a partnership, a special alliance. What makes its members cohere? Is it value-based? Is it interest-based? What is the criteria for membership was also asked. Where are the key tensions among the countries who are part of this formation? South Africa's role, I've heard two people indicate that South Africa and Brazil are the two countries who will push the value aspects of this particular formation. So we've listened to each other. I'm going to ask Ambassador Suklal to give us a 2-minute remark on his perceptions of the discussion so far.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, and for the very rich inputs from all the panelists. Let me very quickly say that, yes, President Macron, France did make a formal query to South Africa about President Macron attending the BRICS Summit. Now, of course, BRICS is a consensus-based entity, and thus far we have focused on the Global South and firstly consolidating our partnership with the Global South. We haven't had an occasion where we had to deal with a leader from the Global North wanting to attend. This is something that BRICS will have to look at going forward. I think it's a new development, and as I've said, BRICS is not a closed entity, and I think it's important that we dialogue with all partners going forward. Secondly, I think it's also important, I think the point was made that BRICS is not a homogeneous entity. We're quite different in many ways, and I think this point was alluded to. But there are certain central elements that serves as the glue that binds BRICS together. And I think this is championing reform, championing issues of development, the Global South, and creating a more equitable order. And I think it's also important to note that there are two giants in the configuration in the form of India and China. But if you look at the BRICS declaration, there is no footprint of any one country dominating the outcome document. And I chaired that negotiations. And I can assure you, South Africa is a bridge builder. Countries would like to see their respective positions taking preeminence in the outcome document. We did not allow that because BRICS is supposed to be an entity that takes into account the interest of all of us and find consensus and collectively reflect this. I think it's also important, not just the Johannesburg II Declaration, but also the New Delhi Leaders Summit Declaration. There's no finger pointing. There's no attempt to isolate countries and to name and shame countries selectively, unlike the G7 declaration. And I think that's one of the major strengths of BRICS, is that we recognize there are major challenges coming from various sources, including from the Global South in some instances. But naming and shaming countries and isolating countries through various means, including unilateral sanctions, to which the declaration also speaks very strongly against, doesn't serve any purpose in trying to work towards reconciliation and finding a middle path in addressing our collective challenges as a global community. Thank you, Chair. Let me leave it there.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Gustavo?
I don't have much to add, but I just thought it was very interesting, the insights from all of the speakers, and thanks for the participants for the questions. I think just briefly, I think on the issue of France, and I think it's something that many of us were somehow wondering what was going to happen. But I think to a large degree, I think if there is confusion about the identity and the criteria and so on, I think if France had been added, would add the confusion even more. And I'm here when we're looking to those few things that brings members together, I think to a large degree, France would not necessarily be for me like a very immediate country that I would be looking into when we're talking about BRICS and considering the existing divisions. And I see someone at the chat asked about what does it mean with the relations with the United States for South Africa. I think to a large degree, I think there is an important space, I think, for South Africa to rectify some of its relations with Western countries. I think it would be really hard for us to see a West that becomes very much an either or when it comes to BRICS. And I think mostly because the countries will not be able to make that decision. Most countries will not be able to choose, if we're looking to South Africa, who are our two individual largest bilateral trading partners, is China and the United States. So to a large degree, we will see many countries facing the same difficulties from South Africa. I think often the challenge that we had as a country has been a lot to do on how to control its own narratives and how to present some of the ideological stances in a much more pragmatic manner. I do think, that being said, and I think to be fair with the South African government, in the last couple of months, there's been a strengthened attempt in terms of presenting this non-aligned position in more clear terms, and especially when it comes to the engagements in Ukraine, with the African Peace Initiative, with the engagements in St. Petersburg for the Russia-Africa Summit, but also particularly the very important discussions in Copenhagen and Jeddah about the reconstruction of Ukraine. So I think it does provide to many of these countries some opportunities, but they have to be much more clear in terms of how they present their positions and narratives.
Thank you, Gustavo. I'm just having a look at the chat again. There are a few more questions that came up. Apologies, Nosiswe Madladla Rutledge. I didn't read to the last part of your question, which is about ask the panel for comments on the BRICS approach to the war in Ukraine, which has had a devastating impact on global trade, especially in relation to food security, and threatens a global nuclear war. And what is the role of women in ending this war? There's anonymous. To what extent does the lure of providing access to energy products serve as a crucial incentive for BRICS to consider allowing energy-producing countries to join, and how might this disadvantage South Africa's relationship with the US? Cedric, you have the floor. You can answer anything that you want. The comment is yours.
Thank you so much. I thought I would comment on the Russian war in Ukraine and on the potential stabilizing effect of the BRICS and the BRIC expansion. I mean, I think we saw the summit in Johannesburg steered clear of taking a position on the war other than welcoming mediation aimed at resolving the war through dialogue and diplomacy. I mean, some BRICS members like Iran are clearly supporting Russia, whilst most others, I would say, have stopped short of either supporting or condemning Russia. But if we look at the votes in the United Nations General Assembly on 2 March, it's interesting to see that, for instance, Argentina, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and UAE voted in favor of the resolution. This is a resolution that condemned the invasion and demanded that Russia withdraw from Ukraine, where China, Iran, South Africa abstained. Ethiopia did not vote, and of course, Russia voted against the resolution. I think the other significant thing is that 2 of the BRICS members, Egypt and South Africa, are part of this Africa initiative to seek a mediation into the conflict, which is interesting and significant because it's one of the first, if not the first, African initiative to mediate an international conflict. But overall, I think it's important to, in terms of what we said earlier, what is the glue that brings the BRICS together, that the shared interest for the BRICS is this medium to long-term transformation of the global macroeconomic, financial, and political system. And therefore, I think countries in the BRICS, especially I would imagine China, are probably frustrated that the Russian war in Ukraine has drawn attention away from this larger objective. And then the second point I wanted to make is on the stabilization effect. I mean, if you think of the different potential conflicts or tensions that Gustavo also mentioned earlier, Egypt, Ethiopia around the Nile, India, China, of course, Iran, Saudi Arabia. I think the fact that these countries are part of the BRICS, which means that there's a regular contact at all kinds of levels, diplomatically, politically, could play a stabilizing effect in many of these conflicts. Also in the sense that some of the more influential countries could play a role in providing some diplomacy. But overall, I think we need to look at that dimension as well in terms of some of the diplomatic side effects, positive side effects, if you like, of an expanded BRICS. So back to you, Cheryl.
Thank you very much, Cedric. I will shift on to Christian.
Thank you. Just briefly on the participation or non-participation of France in the summit, and also the Russian invasion. So first, I can understand, and to me it makes sense that France is not part of the deliberation because being one of the members of the West, so to say, I guess that would have diluted the the discussions in Johannesburg. But on the other hand, I'm would be interested to know more about the notion of the global South, because I'm intrigued by simply including Russia into this notion, because it's one of the very powerful members on the international level. So of course I said before that it's very heterogeneous notion, but still I would be interested to learn more about maybe from Ambassador Sukhwal what really the notion, the understanding also for BRICS is of the global South, and kind of what makes it, what is the entry ticket, so to say, because again I understand it's a broad term, it's a broad umbrella, right? As is the West, very different dynamics and perspectives. But I'm struggling a bit, I have to say, with simply kind of including Russia in this category, given that there might, of course, different criteria which you take as being a member of that, but maybe I can learn a bit more about kind of the understanding, but because it might also gloss over some certain differences or severe differences and power dynamics which are at play, and which might make it also more difficult to really also put a certain stand on a war of aggression simply. So I guess to me it's quite obvious that Russia really also behaves as an imperial power, and if I understand correctly, that's also the very focus of BRICS, which I completely acknowledge, is to also give voice to certain actors which have not been as powerful on the global stage, right? Also countries, not only countries, of course. But I would be interested to learn a bit more. And I guess I leave it there and close with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Christian. I think Sipamandla could also just reflect on that a little bit. This concept of a global South, is it a geographic concept? Is it an ideological concept? Sipamandla?
Thank you very much. I've really shared my comments in writing on the charts. The one part I want to emphasize is one made by Sisnozizwe, Madala Routledge. One of the biggest weaknesses in relation to the war in Ukraine, one of the really big weaknesses is the fact that the women, the biggest peacemakers in the world, are not being given an opportunity, will not be given an opportunity, will not be listened to for now, because the macho men that are in charge of the situation, playing this theater of war in all sorts of macho posture, are not right now ready to listen to anyone else except their macho culture. both President Putin, from where I stand, and President Zelensky really represent that macho culture and the idea that war can be won, and that the winning of a war is some form of glory of some form. If in South Africa we look for a military victory, we would be in ashes right now and can raise up a flag of victory, but with ashes right through. So we urgently, Mamnozizwe, need a intervention from women across the world, arguing for peace and trying to tell these men that the military victory has never won any war. No war we know what was ever won successfully with military victory without creating another cycle of violence and revenge that must then also consume us for another 70 years and so on. So we need peace diplomacy now more than ever. We need to break the old, pretty much in our case, very colonial culture of binary politics and us against them, and build one of recognizing our coexistence as humans, that we are fellow humans, and that we need to do that. Russia needs to recognize that the Ukrainians are human, they are of the same civilization, they are the same people, they in many ways speak the same language, but are being divided by political ideas and so on. Ukraine need to recognize that Russia are their brothers. They have a long history together. They share a lot. They need to recognize it. There is no glory in hating them. So that you have to end that cycle and build a new cycle. Some call it idealistic. I would rather live with an idealistic world than live with one where human beings are scavengers. They are hyenas, and they simply just want to live on bloodletting for some form of glory. And the side of Russia, perhaps glory is that they will manage the Eastern Ukraine issue. Some glory for the West is that it would have defeated a threat to the West. I'm not quite convinced about it. It's the old politics that has never worked anywhere. They simply bring more destruction. It is the poor, in Ukraine mostly, who are suffering just to defend the ideas of some elite in any of these capitals, Moscow, Brussels, Washington, wherever else. Thank you.
Thank you, Siphamandla. For me, it is simply to say thank you to all the panelists for your time, for your insights, for your frankness in the discussion, because I think we can only move forward if we do put our fears on the table, our frustrations, our interests, our values, our approaches, and I think some of that was coming through today. I agree, just because I work on women, peace and security in answer, we need to not only make the statements about women's need to be included in these particular processes, but be able to put pressure on our leadership, whether it's the UN Security Council, the African Union, or formations such as BRICS, to really live up to what their rhetoric is around women's inclusion in peace processes. For the closing remarks, I'm going to hand over to Sabine Odhiambo. Thank you. And thank you to the participants too.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought there was a disconnect. So thank you so much, Cheryl. Thank you so much to all the participants. In view of time, and also thanks to all the excellent interventions, I don't want to summarize everything we've talked about. I just want to lay the focus on one topic that I want to take away from this, working in the political sphere in Berlin. Because I think we've seen very clearly that the outcomes of the recent BRICS Summit have to be seen in the light of the quest for a fairer and more equal global system, for inclusive multilateralism. And so I believe the discussion we're having here, the perception that was also mentioned about BRICS being a threat to the global order that we are currently talking about in Europe is the wrong starting point, and we much rather have to ask ourselves, why haven't we yet reached this fair and equal system? Because as Professor Zondi pointed out, this is not a new discourse. This is a discourse that has been going on for definitely more than a decade, probably decades. And it's an uncomfortable question for us. We probably even know the answer, but yeah, from there, the main question is, was also pointed out, how do we now in future harmonize these different global governance structures when it comes to BRICS, G7, G20, and by extension, I would also look at the UN system, of course, and the global finance structure. So I think those are the big questions that we here in Germany and Europe have to seriously engage with. Thank you very much. And thank you, of course, Cheryl, for the great cooperation.